Us once again for our second Grand Home and Grand Garden. My name is Jill Berry. I'm the Executive Director here at Morven. And we really love this lecture series. It really celebrates all that is wonderful about these grand properties and the history of the sites behind them. We really haven't had a cold, gray, grim winter, which this lecture series is supposed to be an escape from, so I guess that's an upside. It's supposed to be 70 on Monday, so I'm very thankful. Hopefully you all enjoyed the wonderful cheese and fruit brought to us graciously by Olson's Fund down on Palmer Square. And I would also like to thank Baxter Construction, who is the series sponsor for us, and we really are so thankful to them because they help us keep our grand home in good stead. So Elizabeth, would you like to say a few words?
Good evening and welcome. I want you to know that I am a team member at Baxter Construction, and Baxter Construction is a longtime partner and sponsor of Morven. They work with Morven in many ways. One of the ways they work with Morven is volunteering. Every year at Morven in May, Jim Baxter sends somebody over with a tool belt and a truck full of tools, and he helps do whatever they want to help set up. And I just think when you have 450 people for dinner in your backyard, to have a man show up with a tool belt that is helpful to do anything you want is pretty spectacular. And Baxter is also honored to help with preserving history in Morven, the beautiful building next door, doing what needs to be done to keep a beautiful building working and in great working order. We're honored to be able to do that. And the thing that I like most about tonight is that we're going to be educated and inspired tonight, which is absolutely fantastic. Two of my favorite things. And I'm looking so forward to hearing all about the gardens. And one of the things that I love most about Morven and living in Princeton and this small community is Morven has the opportunity to weave the fabric of community. And that's what's happening here tonight. And I absolutely love that. So I want to thank you all for coming tonight and supporting Morven, and enjoy.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was beautiful. My name is Debbie Lampert-Rudman. I'm the Curator of Education and Public Programs here at Morven, and one of my favorite things that I get to do is every year, for the past two, plan the Grand Homes and Gardens program. And this year, I can't pick a favorite, but if I had to pick a favorite, tonight's my favorite. Anything related to the Rockefellers always has a real cachet to it. And so tonight we have Cassie Banning, who is the Director of Farm and Gardens, Land and Garden Preserve up at the Seal Harbor, Maine. And the thing about it is, having met her spent a little time with her today, she's also, I mean, it's wonderful what she's going to tell us tonight, but she's also this globe-trotting gardener who has worked in some of these most amazing places. So her own story would be phenomenal. But tonight, we're going to find out that she, since 2013, she's been responsible for 30 acres of natural lands, the historic walled Abbey Garden, Playhouse, and Airy Terrace. This property was the summer estate of John D. Rockefeller Jr. and Abby Aldrich Rockefeller. In addition, she managed the McAlpin Farm and Greenhouse Complex that has 6,000 square feet of indoor growing space and a 1-acre fenced outdoor growing space. Promoted to the Director of Farm and Gardens in January 2019, she now oversees all the Land and Garden Preserve Gardens, Duya, am I pronouncing that right? Duya Gardens, Astaku, Azalea Gardens, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller Gardens, along with the McAlpin Farm facility, and we are so delighted that she's taking time away from all of that to come here and be with us tonight. So I'd like to introduce Cassie Banning.
Thank you, Debbie. Okay, so we're going to do a little housekeeping here. And Debbie's going to bring the lights. And let's make sure you all can hear me really well, because sometimes I can mumble. We don't want that tonight, do we? No. Okay, so it's okay in the back?
I really speak into the microphone? All right. I am going to be looking down a fair amount, so you can look at the screen at all the pretty pictures. I'm really excited to be here. I did live in New Jersey for a little while. I was really young, so I don't really, now that I'm back, remember any of it, so I can't say too much about that. But it's been a lovely trip, quick trip, but the weather has just been phenomenal. And like they said, you know, not much of a winter in Maine either, so it's exciting to see spring starting here. It'll be a little while before spring starts in Maine, even with a mild winter. We might still get some snow, and the leaves don't come out on the trees till May. Who's been to Bar Harbor before? Okay, so you know where I'm from. Who's been to Northeast Harbor before? Wow, okay. Seal Harbor? To be expected, yeah. Seal Harbor is just nestled in between Bar Harbor and Northeast Harbor, a little closer to Northeast Harbor, but still all a beautiful country I'm going to talk to you more in detail about throughout the talk. So I don't want to reiterate what I do, but I do hope that by sharing some of the history of these gardens that the Land and Garden Preserve is responsible for, that it will hopefully entice you to come back and see maybe the gardens that you missed when you were there before. So this map from 1915 shows you Mount Desert Island, Maine's largest island. It's about 108 square miles. Samuel Champlain in 1604 named it in French Île des Monts Desert. This translates to Island of the Barren Mountains. The highest mountains on the island are primarily weathered granite rock with little soil, cool temperatures, hence the barren tops of the mountains. Here on the coast, the climate is milder than other parts of Maine, and we are able to garden in USDA plant hardiness zone of 5B, or warmer, depending on the winter, and if the location is sheltered or not. The native soils are acidic, and you all have acidic soils here as well, right? So a lot of similar plant material. Yep. So in the 1800s, painters of the Hudson River School inspired their patrons and friends to come in summer on Mount Desert Island. Here you're looking from Cranberry Island back towards Northeast Harbor and Seal Harbor, tucked away on the southern end of the island. This is from 1900. This view today, as some of you have experienced, does not look much different. These summer visitors were called rusticators, staying in basic cabins or tents on land owned by fishermen and farmers in order to enjoy the fresh air, amazing scenery, and a relaxed pace. By 1880, there were 30 hotels in Bar Harbor, which is just, 15 minutes down the road by car, and the tourism industry was booming. Seal Harbor and Northeast Harbor attracted more academics who sought a quieter social scene. These summer visitors enjoyed outdoor activities, music, and an intellectual atmosphere. These well-off families found ways to be surrounded by nature, but also enjoyed the conveniences of having a comfortable summer cottage. They talked of the origins of brooks or how to add new woodland trails. In the 1920s, businessmen began to slowly displace the professors, ministers, and artists. This new group included the families of Edsel Ford and John D. Rockefeller Jr., who sought out a quieter lifestyle. All shared the love of the island landscapes, and over the years worked to preserve them, so that you and I can enjoy it much like it was in the early 1900s. The gardens of the Land and Garden Preserve, I believe, in a way, began here, perched on a ridge like an eagle in its nest at the Erie. This home and its surrounding 16 acres were purchased by John D. Rockefeller Jr. and his wife, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, in 1910 from Samuel Fessenden Clark for $26,000. Clark taught biology at Williams College and had an Albany, New York architect, Marcus T. Reynolds, build the original half-timber frame home, a romantic-style cottage, in 1897. The Clark family wrote this: "We all must travel up there again some happy day, delight our eyes again with the happy groupings of the mountains and valley, the picturesque rocky shoreline with its coves and partly wooded cliffs, old ocean, and lovely islands." After purchasing the Eyrie, John commissioned a New York architect, Duncan Candler, to redesign the cottage. Candler ended up designing his largest summer home on the island. Granted, he designed many summer homes to accommodate the Rockefellers' growing family, their numerous summer guests, and a full staff. Candler's design transformed the existing romantic-style cottage into a Tudor-style timber frame home with 110 rooms. Constructed by local art contractors over a few years, the final 160-foot-long, 3-story summer cottage had 20 fireplaces, 2 elevators, and a slate roof. The front of the home is seen here from the circular crushed stone entrance drive. Here's the home looking up from the granite ledges below the back side or the ocean side of the home. In the middle of the picture is a stone terrace. I don't know how that's up there. Pretty awesome. So John D. Rockefeller Jr. and Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, who you can see here in this 1917 photograph, standing on their brick terrace, had their first housewarming on September 4th, 1916, with 327 guests.
Oh my goodness.
The terrace was supported by pink granite walls, and the terrace patio was bricked in a herringbone pattern. You can still see the same terrace with its original brick and stonework today. They were fond of vines. They used them to soften the size of the house. You can kind of see them creeping up in this picture. And to also soften the rock ledges and hide some of the walls. I came across a letter once that I have to dig up again that talked about how many vines and window boxes there were at the heyday, and how time-consuming it was to maintain them, which in turn meant it was expensive. The decision was then made to remove some of the window boxes and vines. The plants you see by the bench and across the terrace patio are rugosa roses, most likely a dark pink color. Here you can glimpse the ocean, kind of in the white distance there. That's looking beyond the terrace and the islands just offshore. These colorful begonias are still available in the nursery trade today, and you can still see them throughout Seal Harbor at other estates. Here is the ground floor hall, I believe. The main hallway alone required 7 flower arrangements. 50 flower arrangements were desired for the entire home. So the surrounding landscape was kept wild, or as we call it today, native. They manicured the huckleberry, low bush blueberry, juniper, sheep's laurel, red spruce, hemlocks, and birches, and had many more native plants transplanted in, such as Deervella. They purchased them or transplanted them from other locations and planted them as you would any other garden. So at the top of this picture is facing north, roughly north, and John continued from his original 16 acres to purchase property to the south. So the south's kind of out of the picture, but he had a boathouse down on the water, a carriage barn, and carriage roads that would lead up to the house from the barn, and eventually built a pump station to pump water, city water, town water, up to the top above the garden to tanks, and then that water was gravity fed down to the garden. Pretty cool. We still have that today. He purchased property to the west, which you can't really see, but Little Long Pond is down here. So lands around Little Long Pond and over to Elliott Mountain, and into the north where you see the mountains in the distance to Redfield Hill and Day Mountain. These lands today are either a part of Acadia National Park or the Land and Garden Preserve. So carriage driving was a passion that John shared with his father, John D. Rockefeller Sr. They built 50 miles of carriage roads at their family estate in New York's Hudson Valley. Building carriage roads at his Seal Harbor estate was a necessity. But whether this started out being his original intent or not, he would, over the next 30 years, develop 57 miles of carriage roads that weave throughout the Mount Desert Island landscape. The gravel roads cross streams, over 16 bridges, and highlighted natural features. How many of you all have got to experience the carriage roads of Acadia National Park? You need to go. This serious work occurred, right, with the adults, but the younger generation of 6 children were out perfecting their sailing and riding skills. This is their eldest son, John D. Rockefeller III, on the entrance road to the Eyrie. So when I was walking around this morning over at Princeton, the Rockefeller College is named in honor of him. It's kind of fun. The kids were also outside studying nature. This became his youngest son, David's, favorite activity. They also enjoyed hiking and camping, although from the expressions on their faces, I can't quite tell if they're enjoying it or not. They played tennis. Here you can see the double clay tennis court that's still on the site today. We're not quite sure what we're going to do in its place yet. This picture was taken in 1919. Adjacent to the tennis court, they built a playhouse. The playhouse kept the kids out of the main home on those cool, foggy days, playing squash or bowling. These are the 2 bowling lanes. And as it happened, just north of the playhouse and tennis court, they found a low pocket of swampy ground in the midst of granite boulders and ledges, just about a quarter of a mile from the Eyrie home, and this is where John and Abby began to design a garden. They commissioned their acquaintance, Beatrix Farrand, in 1926 to take on this challenge. In fact, I found a letter that Beatrix wrote to Abby in October of 1926, outlining her fees, $100 a day plus expenses. Beatrix implied that this partnership may not have happened if they hadn't been flexible with the work schedule. She says, "The office seems to be rather crowded this autumn, so that I'm rather hoping that you and Mr. Rockefeller are not thinking of any very drastic piece of work which would involve much time. I fear if this were the case, I should feel myself regretfully obliged to decline your tempting work. With best regards." By my count, she had 7 commissions on Mount Desert Island alone in 1926, such as gardens here at Jacob Diston's Indian Head Cottage in Northeast Harbor. By this time, Beatrix had also been creating gardens for 30 years, both on private estates and college campuses, including here at Princeton. Beatrix also had a family home just down the road in Bar Harbor, where she had spent her childhood summering on the coast, and later in life created expansive gardens there as well. She was intimately knowledgeable about the local flora that the Rockefellers also loved. Abby had two main desires for this new garden carved out of the Maine woods: a Chinese-inspired landscape and a cutting garden, or we call the flower garden. The Asian influence is seen throughout the whole garden, but especially here along the 420-foot-long spirit path that you can see in this 1935 photograph. The Asian inspiration came from a visit that John and Abby took to China, Japan, and Korea in 1921. As Beatrix's design took shape, they worked with Yamanaka and Company to acquire sculptures, such as these Korean granite tomb guardians that date between 17th and 18th century. The sourcing of the sculpture was a collaborative effort. A letter from Beatrix to Abby in December of 1926 gives us an insider's view of their process. She says, "After leaving your house, I went directly to Yamanaka and saw Mr. Maya, who very kindly showed me the various articles in their basement of which he had spoken to you. He apparently had thought of putting a foo dog at each corner of the square pool, and further, had a lotus ornament in the middle, of which he still further adding another figure holding a further lotus. It all seemed to me too complicated and crowded, and therefore I told him that unless you particularly wished to take any one of the objects he showed me, that I would not take the responsibility of advising you to add these to your other, very simple and dignified Korean figures." But she goes on, she's not done. A rather lovely bowl-shaped piece of stone seemed to be over-elaborate and late in the period. The 4 foo dogs distinctly poor, but one large foo dog seemed almost too handsome to put in the garden, appealed to me, as did a large tiger whose countenance is adorned with a seraphic smile. So the pool she's talking about is this. So you can see no sculptures ended up around the pool. The Chinese stele holds the northern axes of the spirit path that you can see here. The stele dates from February 29th, 576 AD. Mrs. Rockefeller negotiated the purchase of the piece herself. There is a strong north-south and a strong east-west axis in this garden design. Each axis has a focal point at the end, either a sculpture, such as the stele, or a feature, such as the south gate at the southern axis. Here's the south gate, looking at it from inside the garden. And I came across this letter from October of 1929 from Beatrix to John. She says, "The garden work is going on, transplanting being done, and I'm expecting to send Mrs. Rockefeller tomorrow or the next day some designs to look at for the gate, which are studies based on the actual size of the tile and are nearly as may be copied from photographs that she liked of Temple Court gates taken from what Mr. Jane thinks the best book on Chinese architecture. I hanker, however, to go to Peking to see the colors of the walls and the arrangement of the tile, in order to feel a little less stupid in the work I'm trying to do for you both in the Eyrie Garden." The east axis is interrupted by the east gate, the largest gate in the 2-foot thick, 8-foot tall, Chinese-inspired pink stucco over brick wall. Beatrix is known for her sense of detail, and I think this memo she wrote to her assistant about the east gate that you can see in the drawing here gives you a sense of her attention to detail. 12 feet wide between the posts, and not less than 11 feet in the clear with the gates open. The gate is to be swung outward and is to be hung on the east side of the posts, so that when the two wings of the gate are open, they will fold flat against the outer wall. Drawings were created of all the features and sometimes redone many times, as here you can see two different options for the north wall gates. Neither is the final product. A letter in November of 1928 from Beatrix to John, she says, "The northern gates have been reworked and drawings are ready to show Mrs. Rockefeller and you. But I am not quite entirely satisfied with the roofs of the service gates or even the proportions of the main gate. These will require further study." Drawings were often followed by full-scale mock-ups installed on site. Here you can see an early mock-up of the doorways amidst a garden that is taking shape with plants planted along the upper beds, and you can see that the sunken beds are starting to be amended with big piles of soil. Inspired by the round gates found in China, you can see the final version of the moon gate. Here you are looking from the outside of the garden in towards the flower garden. Now, I must point out that also at this time, Beatrix became one of John's collaborators on the 57 miles of carriage roads that he would end up building. From notes about the roads in October of 1929, John writes, "At the Bubble Pond Bridge, Mrs. Farron thought that it was altogether desirable, if possible, to add bush honeysuckle, dearvella, and wild roses to the planting of the banks near the Bubble Pond Bridge. Correspondence also shows she had a hand in shifting roads or bridges to preserve large trees, limiting the impact of construction, and assuring that the best approach to the bridge or building, along with weighing in on fine architectural details. She was not happy when trees were planted in straight lines." This picture is from 1929, and it's taken of the Bubble Pond Bridge not long after it was completed, but before any plantings were done. Back at the garden, we're standing on the East Hill steps, so behind us is one of the two bronze Buddhas, and in front of us is the east gate that's opened into the flower garden. David Rockefeller Sr., John and Abby's youngest son, writes, "The part of the garden relating more specifically to flowers had a very different motivation. Mother wanted to have a cutting garden not too far from their home, the Eyrie." So this is a Beatrix Farron planting plan, just a piece of it, from 1935. This is just the lower sunken annual gardens. You can see that it was originally bisected with the two crossing pathways, and this is about 10,000 square feet of planting space, so that's a lot. And then there were also beds around the sunken garden, which I think were, that's where they introduced a lot more of the perennials and roses, and some trees were later added to, again, kind of enclose the garden, and I believe annuals were used up there as well. And that brings it to a grand total of 23,000 square feet of planting space. So it was a big garden. The entire walled garden that we consider, the Rockefeller Garden with the inside the pink walls, roughly about 3 acres between the Spirit Path and the border gardens. And at one time, half an acre of that was in flower gardens. John writes to Beatrix in April of 1928, "As I was happy to tell you the other day, even I, unintelligent about gardens as I am beginning to see real beauty and charm in Mrs. Rockefeller's garden. The only danger now seems to be that it will be necessary to increase the Seal Harbor police force in order to prevent a constant stream of visitors from overrunning it." Now, we don't have a police force really today. It's, Mount Desert police force, so definitely I'm pretty sure there was no police force in Seal Harbor, so it was a good joke. lighting. Their son David writes, "Part of the charm is the fact that from any point in the garden, one sees beautiful deciduous trees and conifers, so typical of the Maine woods, which encircle the garden." So the garden transitioned fully to the Rockefellers in the mid-1930s, meaning that Beatrix no longer designed the borders. She continued to consult as needed, and her work with the carriage roads continued, but the garden became Abby's. So this is a partial letter Abby wrote to her gardener discussing changes that she wanted to see happen in the garden. I have already spoken, I think, about these two things, but I am mentioning them again. A small section of bachelor buttons would be enough. Also, only a small amount of snapdragon, just enough to fill the garden. Preferably pale yellow and deep red. 2 rows of gladioli would be enough, dark blue, pale yellow, and a few white. We need more purple in the garden. I suggest we grow more purple verbena without the white eye, and more heliotrope. Snapdragons, gladioli, verbena, and a lot of heliotrope can still be found in the garden today. So a few years after the Abbey Garden was completed, in 1939, Farrand and her husband Max incorporated the gardens that they had developed at their family estate in Bar Harbor into Reef Point Gardens Corporation, an education center for the study of New England flora. The Farrand's house had compiled a large 2,700 volume library with design drawings, archives of Gertrude Jekyll, photographs, and other educational materials. Beatrix's niece, Louisa Farrand Wood, is quoted saying, "The paths were always wide enough for 2. They wound around rocks and heather, cut through masses of yellow, orange, and scarlet azaleas. They ran down to perennial borders of blue and yellow, pink and soft whites. And they returned along the path on the south side of the property, where Farrand's practical side could be seen, a burgeoning vegetable garden protected by an edible windbreak of peach, cherry, and apple trees." Her longtime employee and friend, Mrs. Garland, remembers Beatrix. "She always wore Harris tweeds, even in the summer. She is very erect, very pleasant but stern. We got along fine." Twin Alberta spruce, one of her signature choices, flanked the view to the ocean. Local architect, friend, and board member of Reef Point Gardens, Robert Patterson, says, "It wasn't something you could see in one glance, like a formal garden. It was full of small compositions. You had to get into it and walk around to get the feel of it. It was the details that made the difference." What she liked and excelled in was the combination of colors and textures. She knew what each plant needed. She was very much aware of the succession of things and had a mental picture of how it would all look. Each plant used at Reef Point was preserved in her herbarium, which had 1,800 plant specimens, which can now be found at the University of California at Berkeley, their Jepson Herbarium. This is a specimen of Kalmia latifolia, mountain laurel, or calico bush. Would you like me to read the label? It's down here. Can anybody read that? No. It's very detailed. At the top it says section number 60, so her garden was mapped, and so she had each area labeled with a number. So this was in section 60. It describes the specimen, so it's an evergreen shrub of upright habit with strong branches, effective in groups. Its height 6 to 8 feet. It was in a shady location under pines and spruce. The flowers were white to deep pink. This collection specimen number was 565. It was collected by Marion Spalding, who herself was a landscape architect who worked out of Reef Point between 1946 and 1952. And the date of this collection, of this specimen, was June 23rd, 1949. I also discovered that in 1953, Reef Point Gardens joined the American Association of Botanical Gardens and Arboreta, which is still very much an organization today, and they started to exchange seeds and plants with others around the world. So when the tax burden and the cost of running the garden became too much due to the 1947 fire that devastated Bar Harbor, leaving the community desperate for tax income, and I imagine many other decisions went into this as well, but Beatrix closed Reef Point Gardens in 1955. She herself moved to Garland Farm, which you can visit today, and she took with her many of her plants, as you can imagine. The rest were saved by a board member of Reef Point Gardens, Charles Savage, who, with the help of John D. Rockefeller Jr., purchased much of her azaleas, rhododendrons, and evergreen shrubs. In this picture, I think Savage's crew is planting one of the relocated rhododendrons with a tow truck. Charles Savage managed his family's inn, the Asticu Inn in Northeast Harbor, not 5 minutes from Seal Harbor. He had a love of architecture and landscape design and had close relations with Joseph Curtis, a Boston landscape architect. Charles felt that Beatrix's extensive and unusual collection of azaleas warranted its own garden and proposed to John his idea of creating a roadside garden. He felt this would raise Northeast Harbor's profile as a destination, but more importantly, transform the alder swamp that currently took up residence across from the inn. In 1956, Charles writes to John, "I firmly believe that we shall both be very pleased and satisfied at the results. While it has been appreciated as located in the Bar Harbor Garden," meaning the plants, "the specimens have occupied a rather cramped site there. Here, the enlarged acreage, varied terrain, and happy circumstances of water will permit vastly broadened effects of display. A pond was dug, the alder swamp was filled with sandy loam topsoil, and the stream banks were bolstered with field stones and boulders. And snow doesn't stop any Mainers from working. They worked through the winter, and they created bridges and pathways alongside the pond." I know this one's a little fuzzy, but Charles wrote, "From the outset, it appeared that to the water and azaleas there ought to be added certain accents in the form of rocks. It was but a further step to add pines. The design was wholly determined by the fact of the pool and the winding stream. Having established that general format, the details sort of followed by automatic succession. The inner pool came into being. I had a large rig down from Bangor to dig out this inner pool. Fine cattails were growing there, and I had the idea of leaving a few in one spot as a reflecting feature, and so instructed the operator of the rig. I am sure he thought I was crazy, for he remarked that in all the work he had never been asked to dodge cattails." This photograph is from 1958. Farther in from the second pool, Savage still tells us that he conceived the idea of a third pool, only this one to be symbolic and of sand and rocks instead of water. This sand garden, of course, is the principal Japanese element of the garden, according to Savage, and was intended to be a hidden surprise feature to be approached after proceeding by the two wet pools. Here you can see the sand garden soon after it was completed. John D. Rockefeller Jr. passed away in 1960, but he wrote to Savage in 1957, "May I assure you again that I am delighted to have been your silent partner in this matter. What you have accomplished is charming and most rewarding." Beatrix Farrand passed away a year earlier in 1959. She also wrote to Charles Savage in 1957. "The use of water, the splendid stones, and the art with which the plants have been placed are each and all appreciated, and you have given much pleasure. With congratulations and gratitude, Beatrix Farrand." The home that we sort of associate with the Azalea Garden was a colonial-style cottage along the western side of the garden called Harbor Head or Houghton House. It was owned by Elise Houghton, the first chair of the Azalea Garden Committee and an avid supporter of the garden. So we're looking at the side of the home seen from the Azalea Garden. The home was eventually gifted to the garden in 2004. Robert Patterson, the local architect, who was friends with Beatrix Farrand, designed a simple gardener's shed that was tucked into the rhododendrons in the northwest end of the garden. He also designed an entrance structure built in 1987 when the main entrance was shifted to the north end of the garden and a small parking lot was developed. I particularly like the subtle shape on top. I know it may be hard to see in this picture. It's up here. It's called a theriomorph, which means animal shape. You can imagine what you think that animal is. Yeah, kind of serpenty. Once the Azalea Garden was considered complete, Charles Savage turned his attention to Askew Terraces and Thuya Lodge. He had already taken over the trusteeship of landscape architect Joseph Curtis's 20-acre hillside retreat, Askew Terraces and Thuya Lodge, back in 1929. Joseph Curtis had originally developed a mountainside path, lookout, and a home above Northeast Harbor. He was an early advocate of preservation and sharing these beautiful spaces with all. Joseph was also known for his signage, as I'm beginning to learn. This is one we have in our archives. I imagine it must have been on the main road up to his home at some point. And in fact, he also was not a proponent for vehicles of any sort. When he deeded his Northeast Harbor shore property in 1909, he said, "Said trustee is expressly charged to forbid and debar all power boats of whatever name, description, or mechanical device, past, present, or to be forever, as long as the laws of man permit this trust to exist, from landing on this shore, meaning and intending to confine the use to rowboats, canoes, or similar vessels propelled by hand, and small sailboats." 1909 was also the same year that the Maine state legislature passed a new law prohibiting automobiles from all Mount Desert Island roads. It took until 1913 for an act permitting the use of automobiles in the town of Eden, which is what Bar Harbor was called before Bar Harbor, to be passed, allowing vehicles again on Mount Desert Island. Joseph would have been disappointed. Charles Savage was driven to finish Joseph Curtis's original vision for the site, including building 2 more pavilions. This pavilion was constructed of native cedar with a cedar shingled roof, and a lower pavilion was nestled into the cliff face, constructed of stone. With these kind of views, sailboats. He developed a boat landing and pavilion down at the harbor, so it's under construction in this picture. Curtis had envisioned building something here when he deeded that property, no motorboats, but he was never able to build it. In 1931, Charles Savage had opened Thuya Lodge, Curtis's last home on the island. This was Curtis's fourth and final home. He had 3 others that, he progressively moved farther from the water, up the ridge, and I think also away from the neighbors. The lodge was a rustic board and batten cottage. On the first floor, the lodge, which was kept much as it was during Curtis's time. And on the second floor, Charles reconfigured the layout to develop a botanical research library. Finally, though, Charles was able to turn his attention to creating the framework for a new garden that he had envisioned years ago, now that he was finished with Asticue. He was able to find homes for the rest of the Farrand plant collection, consisting of many evergreen shrubs such as dwarf Alberta spruce, yews, cedar, spruces, hemlocks, kalmias, rhododendrons. All had been waiting for over a year, balled and burlapped and stockpiled on the rear lawn of Thuya Lodge. This is a 1958 sketch by Charles Savage. It shows his plan for the garden behind the lodge, a very linear, enclosed hilltop garden design with pavilions for viewing, tucked in among cedars, red spruce, and red maple trees. He made the garden fit the site. He also used Farrand's design principles from the Spirit Path. Savage wrote in a trustee report that each pair of the figures at the Abbey Garden is succeeded with the next pair in constantly increasing distances with a final, long, rhythmic distance at the far end, a subtle and clever delineation. Here you can see the linear design taking shape, with the beds staked out and the seating pavilions are being framed. One of the pavilions was offset deliberately. The flower borders that Savage envisioned in his words are to be an informal nature to blend with the rustic setting, where plants could be introduced, perhaps, that are not native to this region, but which thrive well here and which people like to see and study. The garden was also enclosed with some amazing carpentry, custom-built cedar fencing, and amazing carved gates. So, today, the Land and Garden Preserve, as I know it, was founded in 1970 by David Rockefeller Sr. and his wife Peggy. They had inherited many of the Seal Harbor properties, including the Abbey Garden, in 1961 after his father passed. They also inherited the legacy of preservation. They created this nonprofit as a means to provide in perpetuity for the private gardens and lands they so deeply cared about. The Asticue Azalea Garden was the first of the Land and Garden Preserve gardens gifted to the preserve in 1970. Thuya Gardens, Lodge, and Asticue Terraces and Landing came to the preserve in 1999. In 2015, 1,000 acres surrounding Little Long Pond that you can see in this picture was gifted to the preserve. And in 2017, the Abbey Garden, McAlpin Farm, and the other Seal Harbor lands, upon the passing of David at the age of 101, were gifted to the preserve. So you can see that our organization has had years of slow change and growth, so that today, the preserve, in this map is the paler green color, and the dark green is Acadia National Park. We stretch over 3 miles between Northeast Harbor and Seal Harbor, with 1,400 acres of natural lands, 3 unique public gardens, 1 plant production facility, 40 structures, 24 full-time equivalent employees, and a staff of 42 this summer, 11 miles of carriage roads, and roughly 10 to 11 miles of hiking trails. The mission of the preserve is to share the beauty of historic lands and gardens on Mount Desert Island. And time doesn't stand still in the gardens, right? You all know this. Many of you have gardens of your own. They continue to evolve and change, but this spring, you could still cross the street from the Astaku Inn in Northeast Harbor and enter the Astaku Azalea Garden through the south entrance, the original entrance to the garden designed by Charles Savage. Today, you will enter through a gate fashioned from white cedar and red maple twigs, created in the Savage spirit using native materials. Carefully tended today by Mary Roper and a team of 4 staff members. You can view the reflections of the artfully shaped azaleas in full bloom on the pond from the roadside, just as Savage had intended. Open from May through October by donation, you can still enjoy the reflections of the pines as Charles had intended during the summer when the garden is filled with rich greens. The same pitch pines that were gathered from a quarry when they were only 4 feet high today help to create the mountaintop effect that Savage had intended. Meant to be a discovery, Charles Savage's sand garden looks perfectly at home here, following the curved lines of the adjacent stream. Mary describes this garden as a place that is still being created, bud by bud, branch by branch, which she has been steadily doing over the last 10 years as the original garden has been expanded here to the west. This is where the Houghton House used to be. It was removed in 2006. Just the pool house was kept and renovated into a garden house with a meeting room and a public restroom. Just a 5-minute walk down the road from Astaku Garden, you can decide to either hike up the Astaku terraces or take the path down to the Astaku Landing that sits right on the water of Northeast Harbor. Personally, I like to go up unless I'm trying to inspect the plantings down at the landing. We have 200 granite steps that were first carved out of the cliff face by Joseph Curtis and later added to by Charles Savage, because that's where you will find these amazing views of the harbor while enjoying the lookouts that Curtis called shelters. Charles Savage says that Curtis intended to make this little pleasure ground with its flesh-colored ledges arranged in natural terraces with its outlook and its downlook. He says that Curtis felt that this is one of the principal attractions of what may justly be called the most beautiful little harbor to be found along the whole coast of North America. Maybe you'll debate that with him someday. After this path was completed, a reporter asked Joseph Curtis why he built the path. Lady Nicotine was all he said. He did insist that smoking shall never be prohibited on the premises or discriminated against. However, some things do change. I'm pretty sure we don't allow smoking on our lands. You can still enter Thuya Garden by donation between June and October through the main entrance gates, designed by Charles Savage, built by his cousin Gus Phillips out of white cedar, Thuya occidentalis. You can still see the linear garden design that is nestled in among the cedars, red spruce, and red maple trees, cared for today by Rick LeDuc and his team of 5 gardening and grounds staff and 4 lodge docents. At Thuya, you can still sit and watch the natural world, In fact, plants are being selected now to provide food and habitat for native insect populations, especially pollinators of all sorts. You can still visit Thuya Lodge, open for the past 89 years, enveloped fully by shrubs that were originally from Beatrix Farren's plant collection at Reef Point Gardens. You may not be able to experience the botanical library that Savage had built and envisioned growing, but you can still learn a lot about Thuya's history from the lodge docents. We also have a small exhibit upstairs, and this year will be all about pollinators that you can find at Thuya. The staff have identified 31 different species of butterflies so far. So if you have a membership with the preserve, or you have purchased a ticket, you can approach the Abbey Garden in July or August through a moss-carpeted woods filled with red spruce, white pine, balsam fir, yellow birch, and moose maples to get your first glimpse of the pink Chinese-inspired wall. Managed today by John Knight and his team of 9 staff members who also care for the plant production operation at McAlpin Farm that has the 6,000 square feet of glass greenhouse. You can enter through the south gate, still covered today with yellow tiles sourced from China, and you can step onto the spirit path past the Korean Yi Dynasty rams, just as Abby did, walking the 1/4 mile from the Eyrie home. You will stop and take in the 6-foot-tall Korean tomb guardians and slowly stroll down to the stele, catching a view of the north end of Little Long Pond. Today, the original sandstone stele can be found at the Museum of Fine Art in Boston, and a very fine sandstone replica now stands in its place. You will pass a pool built into the granite ledge, all designed to look utterly natural. This pool makes up the western axis, and it's called the Frog Pond, not because of live frogs, but for the humble little Japanese stone toad from the 18th and 19th century. That's no foo dog. Is it faux dog? Foo dog? Foo? Okay. Glad I got that right. You'll walk into the border garden that will still overwhelm you with its fragrance, color, and detailed maintenance. Notice that there are no bisecting paths. Well, it's interesting. Apparently, Beatrix is not a fan of the solid block of green lawn. She says, as a designer, it bothers me to have quite so large and unbroken flat green surface as this grass panel, and it would seem much less insistent in the design if the walk were allowed to cross it as it used to in its flower garden days. So this change was made in the 1940s when she wrote that letter, and then again it was taken out in the early 1960s. So everyone can have their opinions, right? Pass, no pass. So today there's only 10,000 square feet of planting space. The borders were reworked in the 1930s, and the cut flower operation was shifted to the McAlpin Farm. And there's a hot side and a cool side to the garden, and here you're seeing the hot side filled with red, orange, yellow, dark purple. Farren preferred cooler colors, and you can find those on the west side of the garden, but Abby loved the hotter colors. You can still see the east-west axes and the fabulous details of the east gate, designed by Beatrix Farren. The moss, the flowers, the pink wall, they may awe you, but you will still stop to count the frogs in the reflecting pool. And they're real, promise. I counted counted 25 this last July. Yeah. So everybody counted? You'll want to wander out to the Eyrie Terrace. The home is no longer there. It was dismantled in 1962. But you can still enjoy the same view that John D. Rockefeller and Abby Aldrich Rockefeller did. So please come visit us, see and enjoy how we share the beauty of historic lands and gardens on Mount Desert Island. I put the website up there in case you want to jot that down. You can learn all about us and how to visit the gardens and when they're open on our website. Well, thank you, everyone.
Well, I'm ready to pack my bags and go for a visit. We have a few minutes for any questions. Does anybody have any quick questions before we do the book signings?
Why did they dismantle the house?
Good question. I don't know. I haven't really decided on the official answer to that yet, so
It's a good one.
I give you all the ones that we give. I mean, the best answer I've heard so far is no one lived like that anymore. They all had their own homes. I mean, they're still decent-sized homes, but not to that scale. A lot less staff requirements. And they had already preserved their family home down in New York, which you can see pictures of in the book. So I think it was all about the lands and gardens. That's what they loved. And they preserved that to the T. But the house was too much. It was wooden, really old, and it was seasonal. So you can imagine the carpenter ants and the electric and the power and the water. So yeah, they made the decision. David did with his brother Nelson, made the decision to dismantle it. Tax reasons could have weighed in too.
Could you explain the relationship between the Rockefellers and the McAlpins?
Well, I don't know specifically, but I do know she asked about the relationship between the Rockefellers and the McAlpins. So a lot of places in our neck of the woods are named after, sometimes named after families, or the families would name the places. I do know that our McAlpin Farm facility was a part of a much bigger estate, and that home originally was on the water, and our situation is, we were the support facility for that home that is no longer, that estate got broken up into different pieces and was dismantled. And JDR purchased that piece of the property when that estate was dismantled. He almost didn't purchase it because he felt it was just, I don't know, he couldn't decide whether to buy plants or grow them himself. He thought it was very costly to grow it himself. So this isn't quite the answer you're looking for because I don't really know the answer. But there you get a little bit about the farm. Yeah.
Why did she like Alberta spruces? I can't.
You know, I think they had just really been like propagated and found in her time. So they were, I mean, today they're not an exciting plant, right? You see them in every suburban house. But at the time they were first found or developed, I don't remember their origins, but it was that time period. So,
Everyone wants to touch a Rockefeller now. All right. One last question. Back to
Is
back.
the Fern Garden the garden behind Prospect House, for clarification?
On Princeton University, it's
I read somewhere it's behind the Wyman House, which is by, is that
That's the graduate school.
the graduate school? She, well, you'll have to have someone from Princeton come talk to you. She heavily influenced where the paths are at Princeton University and the vines and the buildings, and I mean, many of you probably know this, but it's fascinating. It's a completely different style of design than a private garden like this, so it's cool.
I want to thank you, Cassie, and I hope to see all of you next week.